believe there's a way to set a breakpoint in the actual running Lambda. I haven't seen any mention of that. I could have missed it, but I don't think it's there. But that's one of the reasons I structured it to have very little of the code in the Lambda, is that everything else is straightforward Java. So like, I was writing this, I wrote unit tests as I was going along, and I'm just running any clips like any other piece of code. You can set breakpoints and things there. But if you actually need to see what's going on while you're in operation, I think log statements are the only thing you're going to get.
How do you run them locally to debug them?
Just wrote a unit test, which you could argue is an integration test, but it basically has the URL for a local MySQL database in this case, and the test fires up or makes an instance of this class, passes it the URL of the local database that has the corresponding data and known data in it, and then you run queries against it and you do your inserts. I wanted to do something with one of the in-memory databases like H2, because that way you can blow it all away and start fresh every time. But I didn't have time to get that operational, so I went to MySQL that I already had on my machine. Other questions? Yeah, let's see. Start the presentation. So, looking back at all this, what has it shown? Well, number one, it does actually work as advertised. You can do RESTful endpoints, you can hit a database. I'm comfortable with that all works now. Thinking about what you've got, the thing that strikes me is that this is allowing you to outsource much of your hosting operations. I think it's allowing you to outsource basically as much as you ever could without outsourcing the writing of your code itself, because you've outsourced, you don't even know what the server is. So you're obviously not taking care of it. There are some caveats though. There's a learning curve as you saw, and then every so often you'll get a slow response. That if you have, if your existing instances of your Lambda function are busy, it's going to spin up a new one. But if you have something like Java or C#, you're going to have a startup time, and then no matter what you do, you're going to have a connection to the database. And there's things that people are doing, like warming it and generating a certain amount of traffic, because as long as you got traffic, then it will keep your Lambdas around. And people are saying they're getting pretty good results for that, but if it's going to go to volume, I want to test it some. And you have to think some about your SLA. Most websites can get by with a slow page every once in a while, but I wouldn't use this for something like high volume trading in the stock market or something like that. You have to meet that SLA every single time. And as I said before, your Nanofunctions are integrating with the database level. You've got multiple pieces of code sharing that table, so you've got all the downsides you probably know about already with that. The database tables are becoming kind of an API, and if you make a change, you have to figure out what all will break. That's why I did that structure where the model objects are separate, so at least it's more obvious that there's a shared resource there. It also struck me, Amazon decided that Lambda wasn't a going business and closed it down. I could reuse most of the code I wrote, except for the really Lambda-specific parts, but you would have to find some way of hosting it, some other way of hosting it. A couple alternatives to all this stuff that I've showed you about how to get this working. There's a new thing called the Serverless framework, serverless.com. We'll talk more about that. And Ansible, we've been having good experiences with Ansible on monolith, so I want to see how much Ansible could help me out. So the serverless.com framework, it's a little unclear if you go and look at it. It is an open source project. I found that stated clearly, but it's also a company, and so basically I want to make sure that I was dealing with an open source framework. It requires Node.js to run it. It says it can also deploy Python and Java. Their examples are heavily Node-centric. And it goes to, you can deploy it AWS, Azure, Google, IBM OpenWhisk. So it looks very promising. It's clearly open days. One of the things that I took the forum posts 100 plus off their website because I thought if that's supposed to impress me, I'm not sure that it's working. I also personally think that they should rename their framework, because if you Google serverless framework, even in quotes, you get a whole bunch of hits that are not relevant at all. I think if they called it Go the framework, you'd be better off. like I said, something to keep an eye on. It could take a lot of the pain out of this. Ansible was a mixed bag. It's got Lambda support. That's all baked in and solid. It's promising. But the API gateway is not part of Ansible yet. I found this GitHub project that is clearly, clearly documented that it's early for that, which is kind of unfortunate because that was the part that gave me the most difficulty. And then it struck me while I was going through this that, hey, it could be an open source project. If you've got these things, there's no inherent reason you couldn't deploy a bunch of them inside of, say, Tomcat and have your own code doing the business of loading up the functions and imitating the Lambdas. And in fact, at the break, someone was telling me IBM has a project, Apache OpenWhisk, I think they said it was, to do this, at least for things that are done on the IBM project. But if you're looking for an open source project, this might be a lot of fun to write. And that is the presentation. Any further questions?
Can you weigh where you feel like you are now versus your original objective of kind of finding a way to break up a monolith into smaller pieces? Is this something you would pursue? I mean, is the Lambda the right size?
So is the Lambda the right size? Well, where I am versus the original objective is that it definitely could be done. But if you go all the way back to that project structure, it works, but at the same time, it's kind of recreating the microfunction. It's going to be bigger than it's going to be bigger than I want it to be, because you're going to end up with all those operations somewhere in this directory structure, unless you break it up. I think it's a good fit, or probably a good fit, if you are either at a startup where you don't have resources to do deployments, or you're at a really large company and the support that you get from your operations team is such that you feel like you'd be just as well off going to Amazon as an anonymous customer. If you're in the middle and you have a good DevOps team to support you, then you probably want to stay with more of a microservice approach. Yeah.
How long did your Nanofunctions take to execute? What was the longest one you had?
The longest one I have, when you hit it cold, I saw, I didn't actually time the Lambda function. I was timing the overall curl invocation. I ran it and I saw one, the initial hit took 12 seconds. After that, every one after that was about 1 second. So it gives you a kind of sense of the startup delay with the latency in there. But that was running that curl you saw that pulled back the list of shifts, so not a large amount of data.
I've seen Lambda time out for 3 seconds. I'm just curious if you ever did that.
Well, I did initially because it wasn't making its database connection, so I cranked the timeout up to 60. I don't hit that anymore. Never hit that timeout.
Good question.
Yeah.
So with your experience doing this, have you ever been different Linux containers previously?
You mean like Docker and things?
Yeah, sure, like maybe Docker.
I haven't had a chance to use those hands-on.
Okay, I was kind of curious to get your take on maybe something like a container versus a more even smaller, specific, fine-grained way of computing. I mean, you kind of already maybe mentioned it. How would you see this being used in a production level of software?
Well, let's see it being used in production and just an expansion on what I've been doing here to have RESTful endpoints, and you would just basically end up with a whole lot more of them. And then you'd have to have something in front of that, either a mobile application that can hit those endpoints and coordinate for a user, or a separate web application that's going to hit them. I think that it really is kind of just a finer grained thing that if you were going to do a web service, and either spin up Tomcat or one of the newer ways to do that. And this is, it's kind of up to you, I think, at this point. Do you want to go really fine grained, or do you like the bigger chunks? Like I was saying, if you're a startup, this looks very appealing because you've outsourced all your operations and scaling that you possibly can. You don't have to know anything about that. If I was in an environment where I had that kind of stuff in place already inside the company, I've worked with good DevOps teams and good scalability folks, then I would not be so inclined to go down this model, because it's nice to have everything under your control inside.
Is that the big issue then, control? I mean, from the corporate GE healthcare, having the control of the infrastructure?
Not really, because entirely independent of this, we're moving our monoliths into hosting in Microsoft Azure. Well, we're actually, odd as it may sound, we're spinning up Linux VMs inside of Microsoft Azure, which actually works fine, I have to say. And we're moving the data there, and the only real concern there has been security, because we have people's contact info.
Do you feel that the Amazon Lambda addresses all your security requirements?
I feel that it probably does. I have not gone into it in detail, but there are, it clearly has facilities there with the security groups and the subnets and everything to lock that down pretty well. I would need to go back and look at it in more detail than I have before I start putting sensitive data out there. And of course, if you had like PHI or something, you need to get the security experts involved in that. The data is actually an Amazon RDS, in this case, or Dynamo, or like I said, I have an RDS instance that does MySQL. So it's actually not any different from any other way that you might put your data out in Amazon RDS. You would need to go through that and check it out against your requirements.
What did this cost you?
So far, nothing, other than the
But
time.
you shared off, you said you did not set a price limit.
Actually, I set a billing alert.
Billing alert. Okay.
Yeah, I set a billing. My question was, what did it cost me in terms of money? Nothing. But I was careful that when I set it up, I was like, oh, I saw this thing. Oh, you might want to set up a billing alert, and I clicked on that link right away because I want to know if it's going to start billing. And it sent me a text. And also, just when I was going through and picking my resources, like you go to set up an EC2 instance, and there's like 20 different things you can pick on, and one of them had a little green thing that said, free tier eligible. Well, that's the one I chose. Yeah, you're going to do production, you're going to incur costs, but for this, you can get started for nothing, you really can't.
But are there, I've never seen the web interface, but are there resource limits set for, you can use everything up to this amount, then it's free, but after that it's going to get billed? Or specific?
There are resource limits that after that it starts billing you. That's just the way it works.
Storage or whatever.
Yeah, well, storage, and for the Lambdas themselves, you pay by invocations. So when you run it, it'll come back and it'll say billing instance is usually 100 milliseconds, and then the actual runtime, which would be 52 or 84 or whatever it happened to be for that particular run. And so it bills you a minimum of 100 millisecond increments. So if you start hitting it in volume, then it's just going to start ticking those things up. I don't know what they are, but I think they're less than a penny each. But you can kind of picture, okay, you hit this thing 20,000 times, you get 20,000 of those little charges, and at the end of the month you get a bill. $20. Right. It could be. I mean, VMs are not that expensive these days on a monthly basis, unless you get a really huge one. You can get VMs for the small ones for $30 or $40 a month for production usage. So I think this is designed to be that kind of money. I mean, it's a big part of that pitch is you only pay for what you actually use. Okay.
Two questions. What is the biggest shortcoming you found along the way? Would you expect to have fixed by now? But you found that they fall short.
The biggest shortcoming was the lack of connection pooling, or the lack of some way to start up your Lambda instances in advance or to reuse them. I found forum threads that go back for a while, and some people complain about this. Somebody from Amazon will post and say, we're working on it, and it goes up into fairly recent, and people are still complaining about it, and they're still saying that they're working on it. I just honestly expected them to have a connection pooling facility building. Because if you think about it, this thing's really like your app server at this point, and app servers normally come with a connection pooling library. The alternative they could do is, at least for those that don't have huge spikes, is some sort of kind of predictive thing where they say, based on the frequency at which requests are coming in, we think you're going to need another instance in like 60 seconds, so we'll fire it up now, and that way you can have, when the thing gets created, you can have your constructor, do the startup, make a database connection, do any other expensive things that you need, and it'll be ready to go when they actually hand it a request. You know, they could actually be doing that, it's not documented either way, but as far as I know, they're not. So, yeah, that was the biggest shortcoming. Did you have another question?
Yes, a follow-up. I did see the parameter to deploy to different stages. You know, a specific keyword,
Yeah.
task plot, whatever. How do you set it up so you have a team of developers that works, say in isolation or in a shared environment? That is not the test plan, not the product. So it's kind of local. Is there a local version of it? So it can have a team of 20 developers that are doing their own things?
Well, there's not a local version like runs on your local machine, not for the actual Lambda. Like I said, you can write most of those regular jobs around wherever. There's a couple of facilities for that. The Lambdas have a concept of versioning, which I didn't go into here, but you can set up mappings to particular versions, which is like basically a name for a particular jar that you've uploaded. And you can also, you can use like $latest and always get the latest. So you could then have a process of saying, okay, this is the one in production, and we've got an alias for that, and all the APIs are pointed to that, and meanwhile, you can be uploading other versions and they're separate, and you're working your way through a development test cycle that way, and eventually when you're happy with it, then you change the alias to point to that one, however many builds later that might be. And you do your typical cycle that way. If you've got the REST APIs going, then you can set up stages however many you want, and you name them whatever you want, so you can set up a promotion model where you push it to the test stage and then test it, and then when you're ready, someone deploys it again to the prod stage. And at that point you could have developer A have a stage and developer B have their own stage, however you want to do it, and when things are ready out there, they get pushed to the test stage.
Can you do things like canary testing where you push out like 2 versions of Lambda at the same Lambda at the same time, so you can make sure that the new version is still working and yank it if you...
I've not seen any building facility for that. You'd have to build with different URLs or something like that. Or say in a header and have your Lambda start out by looking at the header and then implementing and doing like your AB switch at that point, the header, figure out which one that you want to execute after that. It's a good point. I think there'd be something like that. Yeah.
I mean, the most common way to describe web services is wisdoms. So you end up listing all the operations you're dealing with. Over here, there does not seem to be such a document, like manifest of all the operations. So if you have a team of developers, is there a possibility of collision on the Lambda names and any facilities on those? Or did I misunderstand it? I mean, it's the first time I looked at it.
Well, I did go into the REST documentation. There's a technology called Swagger that they support, and you can import and export Swagger that describes your RESTful endpoints. At the Lambda level, you would have to, there is a possibility of collision, I guess is the answer, because you're picking the name of that Lambda, and if 2 people choose the same name for different things, and they upload the same name, then I would expect, I'm trying to remember, there may be a resource ID now, but I think if you don't have some means of ensuring that your names are unique, you're going to get into trouble. Yeah, if you have 2 different people create Redshift Lambda, and it's in the same account, and it's got the same subnet security group, then yeah, they're going to overwrite each other's changes. That would be, I would argue that would be what should happen. That's what you're telling it to do. You need to have some sort of internal list, or the name of your Lambda matches the name of your version control repository, something like that. Is there a question over there?
Did Oracle Web Services have an answer for this?
I'm sorry?
Did Oracle Web Services have an answer for this?
I did not look. I guess there's just more of them than I can keep up with these days. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, thank you all for coming.